Good morning, good evening. Welcome to the GridOS Zero Trust Grid Security Model webinar. This is the third installation of our GridOS series, and I'm Doug Phillips. I'm a Senior Director of Marketing here at GE Digital, focused on our product marketing area. And with me today is Matt Urich, Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance at GE Digital. And we're excited to give you a talk today about our Zero Trust Grid Security solution inside GridOS. So if we think about moving forward in the energy transition, when we think about the utilities movements going from the past to the future, we clearly have some serious changes happening in the market today. And those changes are going to really focus on how many endpoints are going to be installed with DERs and EVs connections throughout the network. And so as you can see here, throughout the transition, more and more surface area is being generated for security measures because we are really expanding how many people are accessing the utility network. And so really what we want to focus on today is what can we do as an industry to bring forward more security, to bring more and more energy for more people around the world. And so it's really not just about security for the things that we see every day, which is the passwords and identity theft. We wanted to bring forward some examples where security concerns are both large in scale or very severe in impact. So the first is in Zoom communications. Probably many of you saw in 2020 during the pandemic, there was a Zoom bombing episode where hackers would go in and control video conferencing sessions with customers or people. And so what that did was it really enabled a large swath of people during a pandemic to get access and really caused a lot of disturbances. So while its impact was pretty negligible, I think it's clear that the impact was very wide and very concerning and required a lot of patches in order to thwart that. The second one, which is really more severe, and that is the Colonial Pipeline of 2021. Many of you in the utility industry really focused on this because it really was one of the biggest cyber attacks on a major infrastructure play in the United States. And I think that, affecting 17 states in the US, President Biden declaring an emergency, and really the hacker group known as DarkSide being responsible, it really brought to bear what security means for critical infrastructure. And obviously that's something that we're a part of today. And the third is really about the scale. So while passwords and identity theft are in the news a lot, their impact on average is very low, but it can have financial impact. And so as the network grows and as the number of endpoints grow for electric utilities, clearly that will start to bring to bear big financial impacts for utilities around the world. In this case, with T-Mobile as an example, they had a breach that had a $500 million settlement that affected roughly 76 million people. And so while each utility doesn't have 76 million people connected, it is growing exponentially, and it can be a pretty big financial exercise for those who are being affected. And so these three examples are really many that are considered to be good examples of why we need better security to grow with the market going forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt Urich, who's going to go through our platform and our security details, and really excited for him to give some background on Zero Trust. Matt?
Thanks, Doug. We often get the question as we're presenting about GridOS, what is meant by a Zero Trust grid security model? Hopefully you've been attending the other sessions with presenters like Jean-Marc and Sean Mosier talking about what is GridOS overall. And we're going to deep dive into the GridOS Zero Trust piece today. So again, looking at GridOS, we've got our plan, operate, and transact applications sitting on the top. But underneath all of that, we have a common platform. And Zero Trust is one of the key tenets of that platform. And in fact, in some ways, some of the most important pieces of that platform. What we've done is we've adapted the Zero Trust security model from NIST 800-207. And if you look at how that works, we have kind of different pieces of the Zero Trust model. The first is the actual model. So you can think of that as who, meaning Matt or Doug, for example, can perform what action, right? So open a breaker, acknowledge an alarm, on what object, so on what particular substation or what RTU, on what alarm specifically, from where, meaning from my house, from the control room, from a mobile device, and under what conditions. And the conditions can be things like emergency 911 or hurricane scenarios. And so again, we can summarize that model as who can perform what action on what grid object from where and under what conditions. The engine, when you look at NIST 800-207, is simply what does the enforcement, what does the thing. And so we actually have different pieces inside of GridOS platform that do that. We have parts called an ingress controller. There's something else called a service mesh, another piece called an admission controller. There's a couple different pieces that actually serve as different engines. The administration is how you actually set up those rules in terms of who can do those things or what's allowed and what's not. And then the enforcement point is really the, where the system does that. So once the system's up and running and the user's going to log in or taking action, where in that system is that actually controlled? Is it when they're calling an API? Is it when a new application is being loaded to be admitted and run? So that's kind of what's meant when you look at NIST 800-207 by those different pieces. Around the outside of that grid security model, we have the kind of security infrastructure that utilities and other industries have heavily invested in today. Things like SEM systems for activity log monitoring, alerting, identity management systems, Active Directory or IDPs, public key infrastructure for certificates, as well as continuous diagnostic and monitoring systems around the outside as well. And the benefits of adopting this kind of model within GridOS is, as Doug kind of alluded to at the beginning, we're seeing all of these new threats, not just from that perimeter that's being more and more holes poked through it in terms of DER connectivity and mobile workforce and those kind of things, but we're also seeing supply chain attacks where you have trusted parties inside, getting into the system, getting inside the system and having to defend against those kind of attacks. We see disgruntled employees leaving behind traces as they're leaving companies. And so we want to make sure that we're applying to some of these most critical systems that are controlling our way of life and our electric supply. We want to make sure we're protecting against all of those different threats. We also recognize at GE that while it might be slow in the OT and ICS space, move to the cloud is inevitable. We know that it's not necessarily today, but it's coming. And we can start by doing things like non-production workloads, so training simulators or some of the analytics. And part of being on the cloud when you're in that kind of infrastructure and have that much more attack surface from outside your six walls, you have to be secure. So we want to make sure that when that pivot happens, when our customers are ready for that move, we're ready and our software is ready. Again, we've built this using NIST 800-207 as well as the CISA Zero Trust maturity model, which I'll take you through in a couple minutes here. And we've also seen some other revisions to those come out, or other organizations put out their Zero Trust maturity model or guidance, such as NCSC in the UK. And we've actually seen that what we've done measures up quite well against those as they emerge. We also recognize that this industry is undergoing some changes in terms of personnel. It's started with the pandemic and it's kind of continued on since then, which is that we have people that are sitting outside of the control room, potentially needing to do some of these critical operations. We also see new workforce coming in, younger generation coming in. They want that flexibility to be able to work from home. And how can we do that if we're stuck in this kind of 80s, 90s security model? So we have to build for that future generation, that control room of the future, that distributed control room of the future. So a lot of people ask, what is Zero Trust? If you actually look online at a number of different sources, you'll see that there's quotes about a Zero Trust architecture being an approach to design that believes the network is compromised, that somebody's already inside of your network. But I think that's really only looking at one particular piece of an IT, OT infrastructure system. There's a bunch of other aspects that, could be compromised and should not be trusted. A user, for example, might not be trusted, right? Or the software itself might not be trusted. I think we need to challenge that the definition is only that the network is hostile and has been compromised, and actually look at each of the different parts of the system historically where we've had implicit or inherent trust in a particular thing. So let's look at what some of those might be. You can think of our existing OT ICS systems in many industries as the castle and moat analogy, which I think many people have heard over the years. And the concept is that the moat around that castle is the air gap, if you will, which has been a bad word for a number of years. As we've seen with Stuxnet, for example, that you can jump that air gap. So it's not truly an air gap, but you put defenses around that. Right? You put maybe an intrusion protection system that looks at that border and the traffic crossing that moat. You maybe put a guard at the gate between where you have your IT system connecting to your OT through some kind of DMZ. You obviously have very protected OT firewalls separate from the IT group. And then we have these different kind of security infrastructure components that, again, I would say, bolted on to these systems. Things like the SEM monitoring, which is a reactive component, right? The system's already generated a security alert, and now somebody gets that on their phone or in a SOC, and they see those kind of alerts flash up. You have network IDSs that, again, try to look at some of the traffic, or host IDSs installed on servers and on the endpoints. Has to be compatible, of course, with your vendor in this kind of archaic model. And we have our antivirus and endpoint detection response solutions, potentially. And then at the very heart of all of that, the thing that we're trying to protect the most in this previous model is the SCADA system itself, the things that's doing the controls out to the field, right? Or that's getting the telemetry back to give us visibility into the state of the network. But with all this new connectivity that Doug alluded to at the beginning with DER, electric vehicles, mobile workforce, how do we know that for this castle model, the person that's made their way into the castle, into the courtyard, is actually who they say they are, and that they haven't suffered some kind of identity theft? How do we know that in the castle that there might be trusted parties, right? There's knights and members of the king's court. How do we know that they're not trying to break into the vault and doing something they're not supposed to be doing within those castle walls once they're already trusted and inside? How do we know that a guest that we've brought in or allowed in hasn't outstayed their welcome? We've all had that house guest that stays just 1 or 2 days too long, and we don't want them around anymore. How do we know that that guard at the gate, for example, hasn't been bribed? There's actually a lot of concern that we talk to about our customers today, where it's not what the system does or what the vendor does. It's that, in this crazy world we live in, somebody has found their way into physically the perimeter or into one of these places where there's a remote connection, and there's a hostile person basically forcing a remote worker or a remote vendor to do something using the control system that the person doesn't really want to do, but their family's potentially in the other room being held hostage. We get that actual concern expressed from our customers. And so how do we know that the person hasn't been bribed or isn't being forced to do something that they don't want to do against their will? We also rely heavily on this kind of air gap and this moat and this drawbridge scenario, that there's really only one way in and out. But how do we know that somebody hasn't dug under that moat and dug a tunnel underneath there and can get up underneath that system or underneath that castle that we're not aware of? My personal favorite on this list is, even though the knight and the queen are trusted parties inside the castle, how do we know that they're not flirting? They're not doing something behind the king's back that they're not supposed to be doing when they're not supposed to be even talking to each other? We have to get stuff in and out of the castle. right? Whether it's weather data, whether it's antivirus updates, whether it's updates to the control system itself. How do we know that that gift coming across the drawbridge isn't a Trojan horse? And what if we have some parties coming in, foreign dignitaries, and maybe they're speaking in a foreign language within our castle walls, and they're our trusted guests, but maybe using that foreign language, they're actually plotting against us. But what about the actual castle itself? How do we know that the pieces that make up this castle, the hard perimeter inside, is not, if it's lumber rotting in that drawbridge, or if it's in the masonry, that it's not crumbling? And we use this as an analogy to look at an ICS system and what we're doing with GridOS by adding these kind of pieces. So for the first piece, in terms of who the user is, who they say they are, that's their identity, right? Within the system, that's their username. It's supposed to uniquely identify them. In terms of what they're allowed to do, whether that's breaking into the vault or not supposed to be doing those kind of things, that's the permission that user gets once they're within the system. In terms of outstaying their welcome, we can think about that as session length. So when we connect to a web application, you have what's called a session, and those can last anywhere from 15 minutes, which you see very often, for example, on your bank account when you're logged in to do some kind of remote transaction, or it can last for a much longer time. So how do we manage the length of those sessions and how many of them there can be and where they're coming from? And we'll get into all of these things as we go through the next couple pieces of the presentation. In terms of that connectivity coming in, we can look at where the connections are coming from the clients, whether it's coming from a trusted device or not. The services, the trusted parties inside the castle that are talking when they're not supposed to, is the service-to-service connections. And so again, with this castle analogy, we see a lot of trust between this SCADA server and that SCADA server, or the front end and the UI server, and all of these different pieces that make up existing OT and ICS systems. But how we can secure those communications between those different endpoints on those assets with our zero trust model going forward with this new architecture. Of course, coming across the drawbridge, we have the delivery of our installer, the vendor's installer, in terms of what's inside that piece of software, what is that software allowed to do. And then we also have a lot of today proprietary protocols in OT systems where maybe the technology wasn't where it needed to be 20 or 30 years ago. And so the vendors in this space had to create protocols that basically modern IDSs and IPSs can't understand the protocols and dissect them to do their alerting, to do their job, to look for those kind of things. And then with the brick and mortar itself, that's could be construed as the software, the system itself, in terms of how well it's being maintained and kept up. So when we talk about all those different things, that's what we're looking at when we say, what is zero trust and what does it mean to GE? Now we're going to transition into, okay, so if that's all of the different pieces that can be compromised, that have inherent trust in the system, and how we can relate that to the actual technology system, we're going to get into how we've built that into GridOS. So first off, this is all built in. It's not something that we're developing GridOS and then we're going to tack on later. It's not something that is 2 or 3 years away, which we'll get into. But it's really built around those principles that we already went through in terms of where there's implicit or inherent trust in those parties or in those pieces of a system. And we've categorized those into these different buckets here. And we'll go into further detail on each of those in a minute. We also want to make sure that this is maintained as we go forward, as we look at GridOS being this partner ecosystem, using our partners or working with trusted customers or other third parties to develop apps for the system. We're going to expect them to adhere to these same principles that are built into the system, because if you don't, effectively your software and your applications that you put on top of GridOS won't actually run and operate the way that they're supposed to. Let's get into some of the details. On the identity, again, we talked about that the party is who they say they are. If we look at the identity, existing systems, again, you have some faith that because the person has used a username that exists in the system, that they're actually who they are supposed to be behind that keyboard. But you can't be assured of that anymore in today's technology world. So we can protect against that by using multi-factor authentication, built into GridOS already from day one, where we can enforce that those users connecting interactively to the system use some kind of token to get into the system. We do have support for one of the major players out there today, and we're going to continue to add other ones as we continue to evolve the platform. Between the client and the UI, for example, a lot of OT systems today, they don't use encryption between those communication points. So if you have a compromised network and somebody's inside that network, they can be sniffing that traffic, and maybe they'll see your username and password passing in the clear. We did that in this industry because there were concerns about certificates expiring, and there were concerns about the speed of the system, and some of those protocols between the client and the server didn't actually support encryption. But when we move to modern technology that's built for these kind of things, and it's linked with some of these other pieces that we've put into GridOS, such as key rotation, you don't have to worry about some of these certificates expiring. So all of that communication between the end user and the backend servers is encrypted. So there is no sniffing of passwords or over the wire. Existing systems also rely very much on shared user accounts in some ways, because there's challenges with shift change. Again, there's just been challenges connecting to Active Directory servers or other identity management systems. And they weren't designed for that. They were designed for 2, 3, 5, 10 users. And we've made some progress in that area with our platforms. But really, the whole point of moving to GridOS and our Zero Trust model is that that user is who they say they are, and there's non-repudiation. There's no way that that person logging into the system can be anybody else, and there is no shared user accounts within the system. Everything has been federated from a trusted external identity management store. Again, Active Directory, LDAP, some kind of SAML IDP, for example, like Okta. If you then look at how existing systems connect to those external parties or databases on the back end, right? They have to retrieve that username and password from somewhere. Maybe that is unencrypted, whether it's connecting to a database and it's on the back end, it's encrypted, or it's connecting to Active Directory or LDAP. Maybe it's using LDAP instead of LDAP-S, so it's not the secure version. And so again, if we have somebody inside the network that's doing some kind of wire sniffing, they're going to see those credentials passing in clear text. And then the last piece of identity is, there's often some kind of cache or local store within an ICS OT system today that has that user and has their password inside of a database or inside of LDAP. And you see a lot of these attacks where somebody's gotten into that backend system and they dump the users and they dump the passwords, and then they crack it off site so they can then come back and attack you with those later. But because we're not hosting any of those user stores or credential stores, password stores locally within inside GridOS, there is no threat on our side of the software that, oh, some cached password has been compromised or cracked off site. As we move into the session piece, we see again, sessions are your connection to the backend asset in terms of how long you're allowed to continue operating inside of that login session before you have to log in again. And if we look at sessions today in OT and ICS systems, many of them have static, indicated by the paused icon there. We have static permissions, so they don't change as the user is in that session for 10 hours or 12 hours, 8 hours, whatever the limit happens to be, that it's that trusted to be that for the length of it. So whether their groups change, their permissions change, any of those kind of things, they're not actually affected until the user logs out and logs back in. Within GridOS, we're building in a session refresh timer so that every so often that's user configurable, the administrator can set up a time period by which, okay, I want to check to see if Matt's permissions on the back end or his groups have changed every 30 minutes or 60 minutes or every 2 hours. Existing systems also have a lot of session IDs that maybe are a little too simplistic for today's technologies and today's threat vectors, right? They're guessable, so they're sequential, for example. With GridOS, we've built in the session IDs to be UUIDs that are digitally signed using tokens. And so there is, again, inherent trust being looked at and saying, here's what we do today. How do we remove that going forwards? And we're going to do that with certificates and signed sessions that are really hard to guess. We also see, as we move again to the right there above the egg timer, today we have sessions that maybe have inactivity timers, but they can stay active for some length of time as long as the session's active. And that session can remain active any number of ways. I can write a script on my computer that moves my mouse or makes it look like it's clicking on buttons. I can go on Amazon and buy a mouse mover so that it keeps my icon green, looking like I'm sitting at my desk, for example. And we saw these kind of attacks leveraged in the Ukraine 2015 and 2016 attacks, where attackers were connected into the system or connected remotely into the system for up to 6-8 months, potentially, before they launched their ultimate attack. And so how long were they in that session, even if they were inactive? If there were no inactivity timers, or even if there were and they had written a simple script, they could have combated those inactivity timers. So what we've implemented within GridOS today is a maximum session time to live value indicated by that egg timer there, so that, again, the administrator can say, Matt's session, he's an admin, I want that to only last about 15 minutes before he has to log out. Again, very similar to what you see with sensitive systems like bank accounts today. But my operator sitting in the control room, obviously, I don't want them having to log in multiple times during their shift. Their average shift is about 8 hours. So I'm going to set that time to live to 16 hours, right? Just in case there's a storm or they get stuck there. But then they have to authenticate after that. We also look at shoulder surfing, for example, right? So shoulder surfing, someone comes behind me, I left my computer unlocked, or I left my session logged in, and they can start using the system like they were me. So we do have those inactivity timers as well built in, so that if I do step away, whether that's physically or remotely connected, the session will notice that I'm inactive, hopefully not subject to any of those other attacks that we just talked about, and will lock my session out so that I have to re-authenticate. And then again, if it is kept active using malicious means, we have that maximum session time to live. Existing systems today, with the final eye icons there on the right, existing systems today, often you don't have visibility into those sessions. You don't know who's logged in. You don't know who's logged in from where or how many times they've logged in. And what we have within the GridOS security administration tool is we have session enumeration and control windows that will show you all of the sessions from all of the users that are connected. It will show you where they've connected from, and then you can sort and filter that administration window to look for, let's say Matt's computer was compromised or Doug was the malicious user. You can search for Doug, or you can search for Matt, the IP address of Matt's client, and I can click a checkbox and I can terminate those sessions. So that user can't continue doing those malicious operations while they're still logged into the session. So that summarizes how we're taking the implicit inherent trust for identities and sessions and combating those with zero trust principles built into GridOS. Let's move on to the person. So the person, again, we talked about some of this a little bit earlier, but the person can be bribed, right? Indicated by the money bag there. They can be given, a bunch of money to do something that you don't want them doing within the system, or they can be forced to do something against their will, as we talked about earlier. And we have, critical operations that can be defined now within GridOS, that maybe if it opens greater than X number of breakers, let's say 50 breakers, again, using the Ukraine kind of attack scenario, that it has to have a 4 eyes principle, meaning I need to confirm it using my authentication, and then it's going to pop up and say, hey, this is a critical operation. It's going over a certain threshold. And so we're going to have Doug confirm that it has to occur. And you can configure what kind of activities or what kind of thresholds will proceed without that, and which ones are above and over that threshold that need that kind of, again, 2-key system, if you will. We also see in existing systems today for OT and ICS, there's a lot of sessions that can be created, right? Indicated by that kind of one-to-many icon there. So I can open a session and open a session and open a session. And how many of those should I actually have open? Because each one of those is a potential threat vector and attack vector, versus we can have now within GridOS concurrency limits. So we can say, again, Matt's an admin. he shouldn't have more than one session open at a time because that allows attackers to hijack his session and connect in and do really bad stuff as an admin. So we're going to allow admins to have only one session. But operators sitting in the control room, maybe they have 6 or 8 monitors. And since this is a web app, they have to have a different browser on each window. So we're going to have operators within the control room have 8 sessions allowed, for example. There's also in existing systems today this concept of permissions and roles, but they're generally pretty coarse. It's things like this person's a control user, and so here's all of the things that they're allowed to do, any permission associated with controls. Or this person's only a view-only user, and so they can view everything. They're not terribly fine-grained. Within GridOS, we've instituted this permission system that uses a dot notation. So you can think of adms.alarm.write.acknowledge as a good example. And so each of those permissions can be individually looked at and then grouped together into a role. And then those roles are mapped to Active Directory groups, and anybody that's in those groups inherits those permissions. And so you can get very fine-grained in terms of what a user is allowed to do. You can also use wildcards within that system. So adms.alarm.write.star would give them all write permissions for alarms within the ADMS. We can get very fine-grained there. We also see, again, existing systems, as long as you're logged into a session, there's trust there that you are still behind the keyboard, that the person is who they say they are. But again, we want to be able to define critical operations. And basically, if it is a critical operation that is going to severely impact the grid or severely impact the system, that it requires the user to re-authenticate during that session just to confirm that you are who you say you are. We all see this today in our daily lives as we purchase things on Amazon or we buy something, we rent a movie online. We have to put in a PIN or a password again to confirm our purchase. And we want to make sure, of course, that the grid is subject to the same kind of security controls in terms of when there's critical operations occurring, that the user is still who they say they are. Also, again, very configurable, though, because we want to make sure that we're not impacting people in the control room. Maybe we can leverage that only for external concurrent remotely connected users outside the control room, as an example. We also have areas of responsibility. That's kind of a unique thing in this industry. Generally today, if you look at OT systems, ICS systems, those AORs are kind of unit dimensional, right? They're kind of one thing, whether it's geography or asset type. And what we've done within GridOS is we've built those AORs to be multi-dimensional. So you can do things like Northwest transformers. I can do a region, and I can do the device type, and maybe I can do the voltage level, and I can do maybe even the model of the device. And I can create just basically any number of these different groupings together to create AOR groups and AOR hierarchies. So I can get, again, very fine-grained in terms of, okay, I don't want this person to be able to control all of these things on the grid and have a major impact and have a major outage. So we're going to get really fine-grained potentially in terms of what they're allowed to do or what assets on the grid they're allowed to control. Another type of person that we see within the system, of course, is the administrator, the people that are working on the back-end systems. And so if you start left to right on admin, again, admins are like super users today, right? They can basically do whatever they want, and with great power comes great responsibility. So you're trusting that your admin is going to use that power responsibly. But what we've done on the back end with GridOS is we've said, okay, we don't think that there's a need to have one kind of all-powerful super user. So we have different administration profiles on the back end, things like a backup administrator or things like a update administrator that's allowing services to be updated, but maybe not new services to be deployed. Or maybe we do have another type of administrator that is allowed to deploy new services, for example. We also, again, see the same kind of challenge with super users, right, in existing systems today, where once you're logged in with root or administrator, your actions are allowed to proceed. There's not really a challenge on that. But with kind of this new design, new architecture, new technology, we're using GitOps and configuration as code and kind of those DevSecOps principles so that all of those changes are done inside of some kind of Git repository, code controlled repository, and there's different people that are going to be allowed to, merge that change in. And so then the change takes effect from that configuration as code, as opposed to I've logged in and I've run something on the command line and now it's just proceeded. Similarly, today we see challenges where those admin changes, if they're allowed to proceed, are generally pretty permanent, right? Once I go and make a change, if I type rm-rf/star on a Linux box, it's going to proceed. Or if I go and change a configuration parameter and turn logging off, it's going to stay off until someone finds that and turns it back on. Again, using this configuration as code, those changes are no longer going to be permanent. We have things that are in Kubernetes called operators that basically continue to try to push the system back to that steady state that's kept in the code repository. You can kind of think of it like group policy has been for many years for Windows, where even if I change something locally on my computer that GE doesn't want me to change, it's going to get reset by the GE group policy being pushed down occasionally. So operators work very similarly within Kubernetes, looking at that configuration as code and resetting the system to the desired state. We also have a lot of these values and things that have to be monitored on systems today, whether that's logging turned on or that the hardening profile is still the way it is. And so we have to go and buy all these extra security tool sets. And what we get today, using the last icon on the admin side, is we actually can get a report that's dumped straight out of GridOS using the CIS benchmark, using KubeBench, that basically looks at the hardening posture over time of these clusters to make sure that, hey, yesterday I was 95% compliant, now I've dropped to 10 or 90% compliant, something changed, what happened, and I can go look at that report to see what tests have been failing. Okay, as we continue to move on, within GridOS Zero Trust, we're now looking at the client and the network. So the client being a physical device that somebody's logging in from, right? So that's whether it's a laptop, a mobile device, a client workstation in a control room. And again, as we move to this grid of the future, some of those devices are more and more outside of those 6 walls, which means that they're subject to being stolen, right? Today, there's inherent trust that only company assets, only utility assets are going to be able to connect into the system. But if they're stolen, they can be used by malicious parties or threat actors to do bad things against the utility. And so as we move forward with GridOS platform, we're going to allow for those clients to be have client-side certificates installed, and then GridOS platform will check that it's coming from over MTLS using a client-side certificate, making sure that not only is the server secure, but that the client that it's coming from is actually secure as well. Kind of going along those lines is there's this assumed firewall protection, right? Again, going back to the Ukraine attack, we saw that there were external clients outside of the control room. They had somehow gotten the DMS software client outside and were then connected inside. And so there's some kind of trust in the system today where if the client software exists, the only people that could have ever gotten that client software are trusted parties. And so if they're performing actions through that client software, then we expect the operation to continue proceeding. But again, that asset could have been stolen or they could have hijacked that software. And so now we're going to put, again, mutual TLS in place to make sure that that client and the software that it's coming from is actually who they say they are. Even within our control centers and within our 6 walls, there's obviously a very heightened concern about somebody plugging in some kind of rogue asset. We even have regulations like that under NIST for transient cyber assets. And so there's concern about, hey, how do we know that even though it's in the 6 walls that this client is who they say they are? Not only can we do the certificate enforcement piece, but we also have within GridOS platform the ability to define known clients, if you will. And those known clients can be by host name, by IP address, by range of IP addresses, by comma separated IPs, or by a subnet, for example. And so you can make sure that only things on a given network or a given client are able to connect, very much like software firewalls, but at the application level. And then finally, similar to what we talked about with sessions earlier, if a client gets infected with some kind of malware or rogue software, it can try to create a bunch of sessions against that back end and even create a DDoS kind of situation where it's just creating so many sessions that it's actually overloading the back end. And within GridOS platform, we've defined throttling policies or multiple concurrent session policies that allows you to basically say, well, coming from my control room, we have 10 PCs, so there should only ever be 10 sessions coming from clients, for example. We also have this VPN connection coming in that allows people to connect in and do work through some kind of Citrix jump box or terminal services jump box. And we average about 5 people using that at a time. So allow 5 sessions to come from that, but the 6th session we want to start denying. So that's kind of how we've attacked the implicit trust pieces within the client and looked at zero trust principles there. Getting to the network, kind of the most common piece of zero trust definition. So today, again, in OT and ICS systems, we see a lot of unencrypted protocols. There was no need to encrypt all of those things because there was no chance historically that a user could have gotten that far into the network. But now we know that that's no longer the case. So we're going to use all encrypted protocols. You can still use your IDS and IPS systems by importing, that master key into those systems so that you can still decrypt the traffic on those trusted systems to look for nefarious traffic. And then the other thing, that we talked about a little bit earlier was you have this challenge where vendors created proprietary protocols that your IDS and your IPS can't actually rip the packet apart to look for malformed packets or to look for malicious injections. And so now we've implemented within GridOS, there is a no proprietary protocols policy, and we don't have any to date, and we won't have any in the future. So all of the protocols we're using are things that these off-the-shelf IDS and IPS systems should be able to recognize and scan. In terms of delivery, we also have, this challenge in our industry where the vendors are trusted, right? It's not just the system itself, but the vendors are trusted. And so when we look at those kind of deliveries coming from the vendors and through their websites or through their download channels, you have potentially malicious packages. We saw that with Black Energy 3 and some of those vendor updates had been compromised and had Trojan horses installed in them. But let's make sure everything going forward is digitally signed and has at least a hash value. You're also accepting that in many ways, when the vendor points you to a given site, that's where you're supposed to download that installer from, whether it's a customized installer, and because your company doesn't allow access to this vendor website, the vendor has to deliver through this other mechanism. So you have this bespoke kind of product delivery model versus now everything's coming through one trusted channel for GridOS, our Artifactory system that we've also shared how you verify the certificate on that site. And you can also see that it's GE branded and uses your GE SSO that you use for all these other sites. So that that's the one true site that you're supposed to get everything from. You're also accepting in some ways today that software that you receive from a vendor is only doing what it's supposed to do. You don't actually know. You're trusting that the vendor has coded it the right way so that it only does the actions it's supposed to. But what if they've done something untowards, or what if somebody's modified it? And so within Kubernetes, there's these things called admission controller policies that basically prevent containers from being admitted to the cluster if they're doing something from a security point of view that we don't like, whether that's they require root or administrator privileges, or maybe in some cases they have vulnerabilities and you don't want to admit a container that still has like a log4shell type of 0-day vulnerability in it. And so the admission controller can actually block those things. You're also trusting that the software, once it's in the system, is only accessing the different pieces of a computer system that it's supposed to, whether that's RAM or disk or shared memory or whatever you have. And again, within Kubernetes, those admission controller policies and pod security policies can actually be configured so that the container can only do what it's supposed to do, such as a read-only file system. The software itself, we have to maintain that over time as well. You're looking at today, you trust the software, that it's secure, that it's been built, that it functions as designed. But there's really today, I would say, a low visibility of vulnerabilities inside third party that's embedded and compiled into the software, right? It's very easy to see vulnerabilities when you look at Windows and it's missing patches, or you look at RPMs on Linux and maybe those aren't up to date. And now with GridOS, what we're delivering alongside the software and the user documentation is actually a breakdown of the CVEs of those third-party components straight to the end user, so they in their security group, so they can see just where the issues are, if there are any issues, and how GE is doing at remediating those over time. You also trust in many ways that the vendor is maintaining that software. So when there is a log4shell type of incident, You're trusting that we're doing a good job and other vendors are doing a good job at finding that and remediating that and communicating that. But in some ways, you have to call the help desk and open tickets and ask those vendors to do those things. But today, now we're delivering with GridOS platform bills of materials, software bill of materials in CycloneDX or SPDX format that shows you where all of those different pieces and parts are. And then we also look at existing systems, and you see this kind of sawtooth model of risk where a month goes by, vendor certifies the patches, I install the patches, and so the risk drops. And then next month happens, vendor certifies the patches, and I install the patches, and the risk drops. And so you kind of see the sawtooth model over time, but ultimately that continues to trend upwards because some of that software goes end of life or doesn't get security patches anymore. With GridOS platform, we've instituted a much more frequent update as opposed to upgrade cycle. Right now, we're looking at quarterly updates, and we're actually internally looking at doing monthly updates, and we've done that in a number of places. And how fast can we actually get this industry to go would be an amazing thing to watch over the next couple of years. When we look at the last piece, which is the service-to-service connection, again, that's those trusted applications, trusted endpoints within the systems today. You kind of have this messy spider web where everybody can potentially talk to anybody. It's unencrypted. With GridOS platform, that's all orchestrated through a service mesh. Everything's encrypted, and it also is doing a little bit of firewalling, if you will, in there, because it's actually making sure that this service can only talk to that service, and that when it tries to do these 5 things, it's actually only allowed to do those 5 things on the receiving end. So that's what a service mesh does. It also enforces MTLS as opposed to historically unencrypted protocols. We talked about that a little bit as well. And then the other part of that is when you look at a WAN and you're going between a primary site and a backup site. Today, we have a lot of protocols in this industry that are unencrypted at that level, and you're relying on some kind of VPN or point-to-point VPN between your firewalls to create that encrypted tunnel. And now all of those protocols are encrypted by default. So that's really how we're putting Zero Trust front and center in everything we do within GridOS, and going down to the most minutia level, hopefully. And you can see here, finally, as a summary, that it's built in. It's truly just one of those foundational layers alongside the container orchestration, the data store, and observability. And we can summarize all the things that we've gone through here, whether it's using the service mesh, whether it's using the fine-grained role-based access controls and policies, whether it's integrating with your security mesh architecture, using standard protocols like OpenID Connect or OAuth 2, SAML, all of those kind of things, or even following practices that the industry is coming out with, such as SBOMs. And I just want to leave you with, this is not something that that you can buy, right? It's not something that you can look at another vendor and say, hey, make your platform today Zero Trust. Because it's a design principle, it has to be built in. And that's exactly what we've done. It's also not something you can go and just buy a piece of software and install on your clients or install on your servers and make them Zero Trust, despite some of the vendors claiming that they can do just that with their EDR solutions. This is new in the OT space. We believe we're actually one of the first vendors to talk about Zero Trust in this space and have a system and a platform that can do that. But it's not new in technology. So everything you saw in the past couple slides, you heard references to things like financial or other kind of trading systems. And we're modeling all this and looking at those and how can we put this kind of grid and ICS OT spin on everything. We're also doing this already today. So a lot of our platform products like DERMS, WAMs, Storm Assist, load frequency control, those are already running on top of GridOS and on top of this Zero Trust architecture. So it's not something that you have to wait for all of the other apps to finish to make use of. And we see that today. We've actually had customers do penetration tests of GridOS, and they've actually, knock on wood, come back with 0 findings in some cases, which has been amazing as the security leader for the platform to see. And this is something that we see more and more regulations around, more and more governments talking about, whether it's here in the States or overseas. We see bodies like NIST and CISA and NCSC talking about these and how to adopt them into the OT space. and we're proud to be, one of the pioneers alongside our customers in that journey. Doug, want to wrap us out?
Yeah, so thanks, Matt. Really great overview, really terrific insight into Zero Trust Security and GridOS. Thank you for all who've attended. We're always open for more conversation on how to protect the network and look forward to working with many of you in the future. We have many more GridOS webinars planned for the rest of this year on different subject matters. Hope you all can join at different times, and we're open for questions and Q&A coming up in just a few moments. So thank you again for attending. Really appreciate it, Matt. Again, appreciate your efforts here to make GridOS security something we can all look forward to. Thank you.